Welcome to Integrated. This is the podcast where we seek to bridge the gap between the intellect and the will so that we can grow as disciples of Christ, surrendering all that we are and all that we have to the truth. Hi guys, welcome back to Integrated. My name is Angela Erickson, and today I'm releasing an interview with Dr. Mary Eberstadt. I'm very pleased to have finally not only conducted this interview, but also finally put it out there. It's been I just feel like I say this every time. And I think it's just because right now we have a lot going on. Most spare moments that I have, which are not many, have been spent trying to get our house ready for sale, God willing, and helping my husband apply for jobs out of state. As this process unfolds, I think I will be doing a little bit of sharing kind of like what's going on. And so if you're not following me on YouTube or even Spiritus TV, I definitely want to post on those platforms kind of what the process has been like, doing sort of a vlog of sorts, sharing with you what we have going on, what we're doing to get our house ready for sale, and where my husband is looking at jobs and why. I sort of want to deep dive into all of that. But for today's episode, in my interview with Dr. Eberstadt, she was so kind with me. For those of you maybe who don't know who Dr. Mary Eberstadt is, because sometimes I bring up her name and people are like, I actually don't know who that is, of which you need to. You need to learn who Dr. Mary Eberstadt is. And I hope this interview sort of gets you to a place where like, yeah, I need to buy her books because they're phenomenal. You can even find her book, How the West Really Lost God, on Audible, which is how I consumed it. It's a little harder these days for me to sit down and read, but I can listen to stuff. So anyway, Dr. Mary Eberstadt holds the Panula Chair in Christian Culture at the Catholic Information Center in Washington, D.C. She's also a senior research fellow at the Faith and Reason Institute and whenever she finds time, I guess. She's also an essayist, a novelist. She does public speaking, and she is the author of several books that are nonfiction. Adam and Eve After the Pill, The Paradoxes of the Sexual Revolution. This was my first encounter with Dr. Mary Eberstadt and her work in my early 20s, and it transformed for me the way that I saw the sexual revolution, and it helped put pieces together in a way that I just, quite frankly, I hadn't seen anyone else do it. Even in the pro-life movement, when I was deeply entrenched in that work, it just seemed in some ways rather disjointed. And her work she pulls from theology and philosophy and sociology, pop culture, all these things, history. She brings them together in a way that is easy to understand. And it's phenomenal. I also really loved her book, How the West Really Lost God. Now, the reason we sat down for an interview today, or at least for this episode that I'm releasing today, is because she revisited her book, Adam and Eve After the Pill. And the book is actually called Adam and Eve After the Pill Revisited. So we talk about her work in that book, and I definitely recommend you go back and get this book. It's different, actually, than her original. It's not like a sort of revised version of Adam and Eve After the Pill. It is truly revisiting the claims that she makes and sort of drawing them out even more and showing the trajectory of where it has led since she first wrote that book and where we are going. So I think you're going to really love this interview. She does such a phenomenal job of remaining neutral, and I tried to even ask her questions that maybe would maybe put her on one side or another on certain things. You'll see what I mean as the interview unfolds. But she's very neutral and almost scientific, with scientific precision. She answers things. And so she doesn't mince words. She gets right to the point, and you can just tell her brain is just it's firing on all synapses, and she doesn't play around. So I think you're going to love this interview. I'm so excited to share it with you. And of course, please, if you are listening to this on podcast and you have been enjoying Integrated, I love seeing your guys' reviews. They just warm my heart, and they kind of encourage me when I'm feeling like I just have loved doing this. So thank you so much for those of you who have reviewed my show and continue to do so. Also, subscribe on YouTube and Spiritus TV. Some of you have expressed interest in me expanding and publishing on Rumble. I will think about that. And yeah, I'm trying to think of what else. Oh, and of course, if you are not currently aware, this month, June, is the month of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. So I actually bought from my friend Lauren, who runs Star of the Sea Gifts. I bought this beautiful gold necklace of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and I love it. You really need to go check out her stuff, and it's of course linked in the description. But if you use the code integrated10, you get 10% off, and it helps support the show, as well as supporting Our Lady's Closet. And her link is also in the description. Which this time of year, who doesn't want to be supporting a business that is really focused on modesty and dedicated to Our Lady? So, for those of you who are looking for more modest handmade dresses, check her out. Also, same code, same 10% off, and you will be supporting my show. Of course, if you want to do other things to support me, you can find that on my website and give a one-time gift or become a patron. That's all open to you. For as little as $5 a month, you can become a patron and support my work on an ongoing basis, which really helps me just make sure I have my costs covered. And also, I haven't talked much about this on my own podcast, but I am a contributor on The Meaning of Catholic. And I really highly recommend that you head on over to Meaning of Catholic. They're on YouTube, and support the work that Tim Flanders is doing, as well as all the other pundits, you could say, on The Meaning of Catholic. It's a great family apostolate, and I'm really excited about the direction that it's going. So thank you so much for listening to my very long introduction to this amazing episode with Dr. Mary Eberstadt. I hope you enjoy it. God bless you. Hello, Dr. Mary Eberstadt. Thank you so much for coming on to Integrated. It is, I said this before, but I really mean it. It is such an honor to interview you. You were one of the first names that I wrote down to interview when I first started this podcast over a year ago. So it's just a joy to finally be able to do this with you.
Thank you, Angela. Thanks for having me.
So today we're talking about Adam and Eve After the Pill Revisited. For anyone who's watching this or listening, I want to make sure you know exactly where to get this book, but we're going to talk about why this book has been so important. I think a lot of the sociological things, I guess, all of these cultural currents have been overlooked with regards to the sexual revolution in terms of its actual impact on various facets of society. And you do such an amazing job in this book and in other books you've written, like How the West Really Lost God, to draw out what happened to the Western world after the sexual revolution. So would you mind telling me what inspired you to even begin investigating the claims that you make here in your book, Adam and Eve After the Pill?
Well, it's interesting. It started very accidentally, actually. I read the papal encyclical Humanae Vitae for the first time in my life 15 years or so ago. And I had done lots of different writing, Angela. I had done speech writing and ghost writing and essay writing and book reviews in various genres. And what struck me about Humanae Vitae was something completely unexpected. So, as you know, that encyclical makes several predictions about what the world will look like if the sexual revolution takes hold. So, on the one hand, it's just a reiteration of 2,000 years of Christian teaching, but on the other hand, it's also sounding a cautionary note. What struck me about those predictions was that I knew from other kinds of work I had done that they had all come true. These weren't just predictions. These were things that came true in ways that the authors of the encyclical could not possibly have seen coming. And so I started writing about that and put out a couple of essays to that effect. And then it struck me that there was actually a much bigger story here. And I came to the conclusion that the negative effects of the sexual revolution really amounted to the most untold story of the world after the 1960s. The sexual revolution is not the only thing that has led to our current social disintegration, but it is the single most important force that is undiscussed, that until very recently actually was something nobody wanted to talk about. There was a kind of code of silence about all of this. And so 10 years ago, with the first Adam and Eve After the Pill book, I tried to break that silence by putting out a contrarian reading of the sexual revolution.
I remember reading that book. It must have been almost right when it first came out then, because it was about a decade ago when I first started turning the pages on Adam and Eve After the Pill. At the time, I was working for Students for Life of America, and I distinctly remember sitting in an airport reading that book and thinking, "Oh my goodness, these pieces are fitting together the way you wove all of these things together." It just made perfect sense, talking about contraception, abortion, resulting in the increase in homosexuality and all these other issues that we're facing. And that was 10 years ago. I mean, how even more so now, we're just seeing the fruit of the severing of women from their own nature, and how men responded to that. So I guess my question is, because I don't see this talked about too much these days, is what led up to the sexual revolution? It didn't happen in a vacuum. And I think we sort of talk about the feminism starting off with, some of these main feminists like Simone de Beauvoir. I don't know if I'm saying her name right, but all of these major players. And all of a sudden, that's kind of what we talk about. But what led to this discontentment among this generation of women who decided that they were going to cast aside all traditional mores in favor of quote unquote liberation?
Well, so the first thing, to understand there is that there's always been contraception, right? There have always been
Right.
devices intended to prevent pregnancy. In fact, the women in the Roman aristocracy were so good at finding these devices that it was cause of social concern that the aristocracy wasn't replacing itself.
Hmm.
On that,
Weird. So like,
so
here we are.
So in that sense, it's nothing new. But what became very, very new was the effectiveness of modern birth control, in particular the pill. And so when it is introduced, it becomes, I think, the greatest temptation that humanity has faced since Eve took the apple. It's really that simple. If you were to ask most people, putting morality aside, what would you like most in life? A lot of them would say sex without consequences, sex on demand. And that's what the pill promised. And so it was immediately and widely embraced across the Western world. And it's really interesting, Angela, because what resulted was not what people thought would result. In the very beginning, the thought was, or at least the promise made by sexual revolutionaries, was that this would actually be good for marriage, for example, because it would relieve couples of the anxiety concerning sex. It was said that it would prevent abortion. And we hear this argument over and over, even now. Instead, exactly the opposite happened, of course. What the pill really did was to flood the sexual marketplace with available partners. And the result of that was that there was very little incentive for men to settle down with any particular partner. And so came skyrocketing rates of divorce, and abortion, of course, was quickly legalized because it is the necessary backup to the pill. And by the way, this happened not only in the United States, but again, across the Western world. Wherever contraception was normalized and embraced, there followed soon thereafter the liberalization of abortion laws, which is a very interesting connection that isn't usually made.
Yeah, there are, and too, with this new ability to disseminate birth control, I also see sort of this trajectory of the government sort of superseding parental rights, which I don't see people talking about very much. I mean, with the introduction of contraception and it being given to young kids, often without parental notification, it's not surprising to see that they're advocating now for vaccination of kids without parental parents being involved, gender transition surgery and mutilation without parental consent. It really started with contraception being normalized in this way and even encouraged as a good, right? So then I guess the next question, of course, is, are women happier after being liberated?
The short answer to that is just listen to modern women. And there
Yeah.
is sociological evidence, and a lot of it is in that first volume, Adam and Eve After the Pill, where I summarize what seems to be the finding, again, across the Western world. women are not happier. Why? Because what they want most in life, and I'm using survey data here, are marriage and family. Certainly, most women want kids. And so, what happened was that the destigmatization of non marital sex, right? The embrace of the birth control pill made those goods harder to get. And we see this all around us. We see it in the popular culture. We see it left, right, and center. This is not something that's confined to one political quarter. And so, what we have to understand is that there's a lot of misery out there, which is something else I'm trying to get at in both of these books, because I think the prevailing secularist society is ignoring suffering here, the suffering of children, of women, of men as well. And what I've been trying to do in both these books is identify that suffering and give a name to it.
So what is the name then that you use for this suffering? What do you call it? Because you're right, it has impacted the family on every level, the family unit, mothers, fathers, and children. And I feel as if children often bear the brunt and even pick up the crosses of their parents when their parents have kind of shirked their duties and responsibilities, which is so common these days.
Yes, so in both books, I make the point that the consequences of the sexual revolution are falling heaviest on the smallest of shoulders. And I mean that literally, beginning in the womb and then continuing on up with the conflicts brought on to kids by broken homes.
Mm-hmm.
And the conflict that is further stoked by a society that tells them there's nothing wrong with this. If you're crying yourself to sleep at night, that's your problem. This really is fine. Again, there's been a lot of self delusion for understandable reasons since the 1960s. And the biggest single reason for that is that everybody's implicated. Everybody's family is affected by these trends that I'm describing in one way or another. And so we are, I think, somewhat in the position of, say, people in the American South before the Civil War. There were good people and there were people who did bad things, but everybody was affected one way or another by the institution of slavery. And so what we need to do is find our way to a society-wide redemption where people start forgiving themselves for their own failings on account of the sexual revolution and moving on to build a better society.
Do you feel like we are kind of on the cusp right now of that? Sort of like, I just really feel like we are in a place right now where things are so uh, divided and passionate on both both sides of the issue, and it seems like we're at a point of no return, or the complete opposite, like a revival almost. You see it even in pockets of the church, sort of this revival that's happening uh, towards traditionalism, towards having and growing a beautiful, large nuclear family, if that's possible. Where do you see things going right now?
So I think there have been a number of really encouraging developments since 10 years ago when the first Adam and Eve volume came out, and now when the new one is out with, by the way, all new material in it. This is not a revised
Hmm.
edition, it's all new stuff. There's been a real sea change, I think, because for the first time, people outside of the churches are starting to question what's been going on. Women are starting to ask, why is it so hard to find a decent boyfriend, for example? Why is it so hard to get married these days? Why is everyone waiting so long? And this questioning, again, is coming from secular people in the United States, in Great Britain, in France, in Germany. As I note in the footnotes to the new book, there have been several such volumes asking questions like this, all of them written by women, interestingly. And it's really encouraging to see this skepticism taken up, not only by a new generation, but by people outside the church. So that's new and that's good.
And that sort of is how things work so often. The pendulum sort of swings hard in one direction, and then you have the counter current that sort of pushes it right back to the other one. Um, one thing that I love that you talk about in the book is this sort of institution, I guess you could say, of a new secular religion. Uh, would you mind speaking a little bit more about this? Because as you're describing, it's not just Christians that are well aware, especially Catholics, well aware that things have kind of gone off the rails, but also if we are seeing this among people who are more secular, but there's still this religion that they sort of adhere to right now.
So, whenever there is a decision by the United States Supreme Court that goes the way that pro abortion advocates want, there are scenes on the steps of the Supreme Court that don't happen about any other kinds of cases. There are scenes of street parties and dancing and loud music and women gyrating and crying, and something that looks very like a religious revival happen
Mm-hmm.
on these occasions. So that's just to give an illustration of what I'm trying to describe here. I believe that the sexual revolution gave rise to an alternative quasi religion across the Western world. And in one of the chapters in the new book, I get into the specifics of that.
Yes.
This religion parallels Christianity. It mimics Christianity in certain strange ways. So, for example, the leading figures in the sexual revolution, um, Margaret Sanger as a precursor, um, etc., are off limits for revision. If you talk about Margaret Mead's findings in Samoa, which she thought indicated that sexual freedom was the best way to arrange society, and she was mistaken about the evidence there. There is no such questioning in polite society of Margaret Mead, nor of Margaret Sanger, nor of Alfred Kinsey, or any of these other leading lights, even though
Yeah.
Kinsey in particular, as his own biographer noted, was using sex offenders in some of these supposedly sound data sets. So, what does it tell us that these people and their thoughts can't be criticized? I argue that they have the standing of secular saints. They are off limits for revision within this new religion. And there are other examples, I think, of how this new Gnostic religion draws from Christianity in interesting ways. But I guess what's become clearer about it all is that this new religion, based in the sexual revolution and dedicated to protecting it at all costs, is not only a competitor to Christianity, it is antithetical to Christianity at its core, because what it does is to reject the traditional moral code that Christianity held consistently until 1930, when the Anglican Communion made the first exception over contraception. So it's not
Yeah.
only it's not only a new religion that is gaining adherents, it's also one that is opposed to Christianity, which is why we see a rising number of religious liberty cases, and we're going to continue to see that.
Yeah, I loved this chapter. I have so many, the chapter you're describing, from revolution to dogma, the zealous faith of secularism. I have so much of this chapter underlined, and I think it is so important that we talk about Alfred Kinsey and Dr. John Mooney and some of these other key players that uh, they have sordid histories, and they really were the foundation of so much of the sexual ethos that has been adopted today by secularists and people who are actively opposing Christianity. You're right. I mean, abortion really is sort of a mockery of the Eucharist. um, Even marriage has been turned into a mockery through homosexuality and calling that marriage the disintegration of marriage. And there's so many other sort of secular sacramentals, so to speak. So, a question that I've wanted to ask somebody, but I haven't seen anyone really talk too much about this. But I'm wondering if you see any overlap between the sexual revolution and the Second Vatican Council, because these two things happen around the same time. And it seems like both the culture disintegrated quickly thereafter and many aspects of the faith. And you sort of cover a little bit of that in how the West really lost God. But I would love to hear your take on that with more specificity with regards to the Second Vatican Council.
So to some extent, I think it's just a chronological thing, honestly, that it also
Yeah.
happened during the 1960s. I think what's most important is what happened afterwards, which is that Christians, including non-Catholic Christians, are increasingly pressured by the society around them to knock off the tough talk about marriage and sex. And concomitant with that pressure, they see the Catholic Church saying we're making new moves to join the modern world and engage with it. And many Christians and non-Christians come to read that combination of events as, the Catholic Church is going to loosen up about the sex stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
this has been going on ever since the Second Vatican Council. I don't think most people, lay people, know much at all about what was in the documents of Vatican II,
Mm-hmm.
but they do know that there was a fight going on behind the scenes about artificial contraception and whether the church would ever say that it was okay. So, in that sense, the events are linked at the root,
Mm-hmm.
because the defense of Vatican II goes on to become, on the part of Catholics who want the doctrine changed, Vatican II becomes something they can point to and say, see, if the church really wants to join the modern world, that's what it's got to do. And that, I think, is a deeply mistaken reading of Vatican II, needless to say, but
Right.
it became a kind of political, theological football for that reason.
The next thing I actually would really love to talk about is the impact of the sexual revolution on fathers and fatherhood. We've touched on it a little bit. I mean, especially
Yeah.
with no fault divorce. But what has the impact been on men?
So I checked just this morning. So I checked something just this morning, Angela, because I was thinking of a book called The Decline of Males. It was written almost 25 years ago by a perfectly secular sociologist named Lionel Tiger. And in that book, he made the case that giving women control over reproduction had made men more and more obsolete and therefore less interested in family life. That was his argument. Now, remember, this is coming from someone who actually said he thought religion was a toxic subject. So he's not coming from a religious place to make this argument. I think that was profoundly true, and that we are just beginning to understand how true. Because now we live in a society where men and women marry later and later. They start families later, if they start them at all. And I think what's driving that is the male sense of purposelessness.
Mm.
And I believe that what experience teaches is that men have a choice to make, whether they will be protectors or predators. So, what happens if they have nothing to protect? And that's the situation that we find ourselves in. Lots of young men, in particular, do not have, say, siblings to protect. There's always mom, I guess, especially if dad's not in the house. But they don't have the kind of reasons to live a sacrificial life that all the men before them had, because the men before them were getting married and having families. So this is not only an issue in individual lives, this is a social issue of massive proportions. And in the new book, I have a chapter called The Fury of the Fatherlessness, or sorry, The Fury of the Fatherless, where I try to get at the dynamic here between unattached males roaming the streets, sometimes committing violence, sometimes joining street gangs as substitute families, as substitute protection for not having a father. And as we are seeing in this horrible spate of mass killings, especially lately, these killers almost always share a common denominator, which is that they are isolated from their families, from their friends. They're living online, they're living in a fantasy world. And again, this is all the slowly unfolding and sometimes terrible fallout of a world in which the gravitational pull of family has been lessened since the 1960s.
It's so interesting because you see with the use of contraception and abortion and sort of divorcing the natural end of sex, which is children, then sex really does become primarily about sexual gratification. And I think too that pornography has a huge role to play in this. What are your thoughts about the ways that pornography has sort of poisoned the well, so to speak, and sort of exacerbated this issue that we're seeing because of the sexual revolution?
The most succinct summary I have seen or heard of the pornography problem actually came from a young woman I was talking to one day who had just graduated from college. And she said, the problem is that when a boy looks at you now, you never know what he was looking at last.
Hmm.
And I thought that was heartrending because, of course, pornography, like contraception, has always been around, but it has never existed on the scale made possible by the internet. And for that matter, the two are linked because without contraception, you couldn't have the pornography industry on the scale that it exists today. Here again, I think there's some hopeful signs. So 10 years ago, when the first Adam and Eve book was published, there's a chapter in there about pornography. And I had published it as an essay first. And you could hear a pin drop from the public silence. Pornography, even 10 years ago, was not something that people discussed, again, outside of religious circles. It was just not done. And there was an omerta about bringing up the subject. As somebody said to me once, nobody wants to know what's under that rock.
Hmm.
Well, 10 years later, we have therapists who specialize in the treatment of addiction to pornography. We have a lot of data about the brain science, how pornography changes the brain, rewires the brain. We have evidence about the sexual harm that addiction does to young men. And most encouraging, I think, Angela, we also have celebrities, non-religious celebrities, and other men from other fields coming forward and saying, look, this thing almost wrecked my marriage. Look, this thing almost destroyed my life. These are very important witnesses. I think we'll see a lot more of them. And I'm very glad, again, to see that this public demonstration, this testimony to the harms of this substance is something that didn't exist 10 years ago and now seems to be gaining steam.
Was there anything when you wrote when you started to come back and revisit and sort of shed additional light on your previous work, Adam and Eve After the Pill? I know that this is a completely different book, but what was there anything that sort of surprised you in your research when you decided that this was warranted sort of a reevaluation, so to speak?
I guess what surprised me was the extent of the sexual revolution's damage. And again, I'm not putting forward a monocausal argument here. I'm not saying it's responsible for everything. But in the first book, I had zeroed in on what harm is it causing to individuals, to men, women, children, etc., because that was an unexplored subject. Similarly, in the new book, what I've been trying to document is its effects on three large areas: society, politics, and church. Because, as you know, I'm making the case that, for example, the divisiveness of our politics today owes something to the way in which the sexual revolution gave rise to a new kind of politics, identity politics. And that takes some unpacking, but that's in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, as we were just discussing, I think some of our social disarray, especially among young men, is also due to the absence of male role models, the shrinking of the family, which is a subject I haven't seen discussed for the most part. But obviously, if you are in a family of one child or a family of two children, you have many fewer resources to draw upon for your social knowledge growing up. And that's not to say there's anything wrong with that. I'm just observing that a society in which, for example, a young woman can reach the age of 35 without ever having held a baby is a society that has markedly less social knowledge than any of the generations before us. And I find that very interesting. So, in other words, the sexual revolution hasn't only changed the trajectory of individual people's lives, it has changed the way many people respond to one another. And in a very paradoxical way, it means that people today are more sexually experienced than their ancestors ever were. And yet they may also be more sexually illiterate if we're talking about what they
Mm.
really know about the opposite sex.
That's a really good point. I just it's funny that you sort of bring this example up of women who don't know how to change a diaper. I just published, or I had published in Crisis Magazine, an article uh, talking about raising the next generation of women, because I think too, as a result of the sexual revolution and this push for higher education, which I'm not saying is in and of itself bad, but it has pushed this idea that as women, our meeting our potential looks like having a career rather than becoming mothers, which is and should be the most aspirational thing that we can strive for, because it's the way that we are created to co-create with God himself. And I actually mentioned in there how many times I've heard from women that they've never changed a diaper, and often haven't even done their own laundry until they've gone off to college for the first time. That was certainly my experience, and I come from a family with 7 kids, so I can only imagine families with even less children who are struggling because they're just ill-equipped for motherhood. That knowledge, that wisdom was not passed on often because our parents were working outside of the home, and they weren't mentally and emotionally present to us the way that maybe previous generations had been. Previous generations tended to have more of a community of people to help walk alongside families. There was more of a network, and we're so highly individualized these days and sort of soldered off from all these people in our lives that normally would create this network. Do you think that also kind of goes back to the sexual revolution of sort of this push for higher education and this insistence of women being in the workforce? Because to me, I see this contraception is really the only way. Contraception and abortion is really what lays the groundwork for women to be in the workforce in mass, and sustain women in the workforce in mass.
Yeah, you're right about all of that. And I would like to add, and I would like to add something that makes me sad sometimes. I feel as if younger people, especially younger women, really underestimate the profit margin and really don't understand that things they think of as choices, personal choices, actually enrich other people. So, for example, in whose interest is it to stay in a corporation, in a high powered job, past one's fertility years, for instance? Well, you could say it's in a woman's interest. She's going to end up with a great 401k. But the bottom line is that corporations have figured out that women are actually very reliable in the workplace, so reliable that they will pay to get women to postpone their fertility, for example,
Or pay for their abortions.
or pay for their abortions. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So women, especially young women, really need to understand that they can be taken advantage of in ways that their grandmothers wouldn't have dreamed of. And that's not to say that women shouldn't work. Women always work. It's to say that the choice to opt for paid work over unpaid work, family life,
Mm-hmm.
um, is a choice that, when it's made in that first direction by millions and millions of women, does not seem to be making many of them happy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, and I've seen it too amongst young women. It's sort of, there is this either or, and I do see even within the church sort of this push for what's so-called pro-life feminism. And I feel as if And I would love to hear if I'm wrong or what your perspective is on, quote, pro life feminism. But I don't think you can be a pro life feminist. I actually posit that, so much of feminism has been rooted on telling women that they can have it all. And that's just not true. I think that's a lie. We have to make hard choices. That's a part of being human. Life is about hard choices, and especially when you're a mother, you make hard choices, and always choosing something for the benefit of your child, that's always going to be the right choice. And that might be sacrificing that 401k. But the legacy that you leave through your children is eternal. Your job, you will be replaced.
Yeah, so I think the problem with the word feminism is it has so many meanings at this point that it would
That's
take a
true.
whole nother show to just agree on basic terms. But I would like to put a thought out there. Not having babies around, not having toddlers, not having large families, I think has really done a number on humanity, because having to take care of things smaller and weaker than we are is part of what humanizes us.
Mm.
And this has always been true. It's taking care of the vulnerable that turns us into adults, for example, in many cases. So I'd like to run a thought experiment by you, Angela.
I'd love to hear it.
I've taken to wondering if the young women who promote Planned Parenthood, who stand in the streets trying to get you to donate and sign their petitions, if they were to spend 2 hours a day volunteering in an emergency pregnancy center, I wonder if that would change their minds. And that's what I mean about babies humanizing people. Back when abortion was legalized by the Supreme Court, there was a huge outcry about it. There were protests, and there never stopped being protests. I think part of the reason people were so upset is that America was still young then. This was the tail end of the baby boom. Playgrounds were full, schools were overflowing. There were babies and toddlers and children and teenagers all over the place, and people could see that connection in a way that I think has become less clear in our time.
And of course, you see as fertility rates tank, it has completely upended the demographics of our society, with there being far more elderly people than there are young people to replace them. What do you think is going to happen if we don't turn this around?
So, at the extreme end of this demographic experiment, we have Japan. And in Japan, there are thousands of deaths every week of people who live alone. And so the economy has had to adapt. For example, landlords have to carry special insurance in case a lonely, meaning a death of a single person, happens on their property. And cleaning services, some now specialize in cleaning out the apartment of a single person who died because they have no family to do this for them, etc.
Wow.
That's a pretty grim picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And before that even happens, what we were talking about is massive loneliness, of course. And you can find this out just by Googling loneliness studies. Google loneliness studies, United States, loneliness studies, Denmark, loneliness studies, Spain. You'll find this everywhere in the world that was remade by contraception. And again, this is not a consequence anyone saw coming, but it is a tragic one.
Mm-hmm. And there have been so many other tragic things that have happened because of just the birth control pill in and of itself, and the way that it changes our physiology and changes the type of men that women are attracted to when they're on hormonal contraceptives. And you see an increase in divorce when the women come off those contraceptives because they're no longer attracted to their spouse, for example. It's so multifaceted. And nobody anticipated that. Nobody could have possibly anticipated that, and the studies weren't done to sort of ensure that this really is as safe as they want to tell us it is.
Yeah, there are a lot of unintended consequences along this road, but getting back to the theme of hope, which I hope is running through our interview here.
Yes, it for sure. Yep, I always like to end that way too because this is yeah, like God is so good to us. He uses all things for the good of those who love him. And so we can have confidence and hope that he will use even this to bring people to him.
One promising secular development has been this renewed interest in the natural and this aversion to the chemical. And I think that's a very healthy response when we live in a world that is full of toxic substances, some that we can see and some that we can't, but that can hurt us. And so the very people concerned about those things should be the ones most concerned with what I'm trying to get out there, which is this message that this revolution thing has really harmed us. And we have to get back to a more natural place where we are dependent on each other and sacrificing for each other and taking care of people, because that's the only guaranteed way to have people to love us back. And
Hmm.
this is something that I think could make headway among those who were especially lonely during the pandemic, for example,
Yeah.
or who are especially concerned to live in a harmonious way with nature. Nothing is more harmonious than mating and starting a family, really. I mean, if we're
Hmm.
looking at it from, quote, nature's perspective. So I expect to see some kind of reawakening there based on these underlying healthy desires to get back to a more pure way of living.
That I absolutely agree with you, and I am seeing a huge surge in that. There's sort of this surge of the trad wife, which I don't know how I feel about all of that exactly, but there, cottage core was like a weird thing that sort of happened during the pandemic where women were starting to wear these cottage-like dresses. Think Anne of Green Gables, kind of old-timey dress, more feminine dressing instead of the crop tops and weird clothes that kids are wearing these days. And I do see that as promising. I think more people find that appealing. And I find even myself, for example, if I go out to my mailbox and I'm wearing sweats or something gross and I look unkept, nobody stops the car to let me cross the road back to my house. I'm not kidding. I actually thought to myself, I need to do an experiment where I do both, tally this up. But if I go out there in a dress or a skirt and I look put together, even slightly put together, 9 times out of 10, somebody will stop the car and let me cross the road back to my house. It is amazing. And so often people will stop and say, "Oh, I love your skirt. Where did you get it? Or where did you get that dress?" And I remember when I first started dressing even more femininely, thinking, wow, this is weird. People are really noticing that I'm dressing differently, and you just see this draw for um, to see that distinction between and see more embodiment of the feminine, especially at a time when everything is so confused. We need more of that. We need more women to really love and embrace motherhood and their femininity, and we need men to really learn how to be protectors and providers. So, what do you think we can do to encourage that amongst young people? Like practically, what can we do, and spiritually? Are there things that you would recommend spiritually as well to help guide people on this path back to their nature?
I'm not much of a spiritual advisor, but there is a piece of practical advice. Um, and I got it from a young friend when he and his wife had their third baby, and they were completely overwhelmed and they didn't have family around. But he said every Monday night, someone from the parish dropped off dinner. And he said, this is going to sound insane, but it was a lifesaver, because in a week where everything else was going to be chaos and you knew this would continue for a while, that was something we could count on.
Mm.
So I think part of the answer is grassroots, mothers groups at church, for example, or fathers groups in local parishes can make a big difference. I think also just not participating in the lies that we are asked to participate in is important. And that doesn't mean that one has to plant the flag in the public square and take on the issue of transgenderism. But it does mean that there are lines, and they're pretty obvious lines, that we just shouldn't cross so that we're not participating in somebody else's dark fantasy world.
Mm.
It's tough, but it's got to be done.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I guess to wrap it up, where can people buy your books? I seriously encourage everyone listening to go out and buy all of Dr. Mary Eberstadt's books. They're amazing. But where can they find those?
Oh, thanks, Angela. So, one place to start is my website, maryeberstadt.com, which has information about all the books and also keeps a running tally of interviews and short pieces and whatever I've been up to lately. So that's Mary Eberstadt, EBERSTADT.com. And the books, the Adam and Eve books, can be found at Ignatius Press, and all of the books can be found at Amazon as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for doing this amazing work. You have just so blessed the world with being able to take a step back and sort of give this different, and I would argue accurate presentation of the consequences of the sexual revolution. And thank you so much for coming on to my show, Integrated. It is just such an honor.
Oh, thank you, Angela. It's been a great pleasure.